Zyla stood silently in the dense forest, her dark eyes scanning the trees for movement. She was a tall alien, her skin a shade of blue that shimmered slightly under the moonlight. Her species, known for their advanced technology and wisdom, had been sent to Earth to observe humans. Thyla had no interest in interacting with them at first. Her mission was to gather information. She found humans strange and primitive, creatures who still struggled to understand the basic principles of the universe. She had studied their history, their wars, and their misguided attempts at space travel. But there was something about Earth's wilderness that intrigued her, something raw and untamed that she couldn't quite explain. Her ship, a sleek vessel from her homeworld, had landed on the edge of a forest. It had been a smooth operation at first, but then things had gone wrong. Some kind of malfunction had knocked out most of her technology. Her advanced instruments were useless now, and she was stranded. There was no choice but to make her way on foot and find a way to repair the ship. She had expected to be alone in this vast wilderness, hidden from the eyes of human civilization. But then she heard something, a sound she hadn't anticipated. A crack of a twig, a rustle of leaves. And suddenly, there he was, a human. A man, alone, and walking through the forest, moving with the confidence of someone who knew the land. Zyla froze. Her species had long since outgrown the need for hunting, but her instincts were still sharp. She could sense his presence, his movements. He wasn't as quiet as he thought. He was a human, after all, not a predator like her. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow dangerous. She had heard stories from her people about humans' hunger for power, their wars, and their ability to consume everything in their path. The man didn't see her at first. He walked closer, his eyes scanning the trees, probably unaware that an alien was watching him from the shadows. He had a rough look about him, wearing clothes that seemed made for survival. Sturdy boots, a weathered jacket, and a pack slung over his shoulder. He looked like someone who had spent more time in the wild than in any city. Zyla's first thought was to leave, to escape before this human even knew she existed. But her curiosity got the best of her. She needed to understand why humans acted the way they did. Why did they destroy their own planet? Why were they always at war? Why did they consume meat when it was so unnecessary, so barbaric? She stepped forward, making a soft noise, just enough to catch his attention. The man's head snapped around, his eyes locking onto her in surprise. He didn't scream. He didn't run. He just stared at her, clearly assessing the situation. He saw her height, her glowing blue skin, and the sharpness of her teeth, fangs that could tear through metal if she wanted to. For a moment, Zyla felt the urge to strike, to show him who was in control. But then she remembered the purpose of her mission. She was here to observe, not to fight. She tried speaking, using her universal translator to make contact, but her voice came out more forceful than she intended. "Who are you?" she asked, her tone too sharp. The man hesitated, his hand instinctively moving to the knife at his waist. "I'm just a traveler," he said slowly, his voice wary. What are you?" Zyla felt a mix of confusion and frustration. How could he not know? Was he truly so primitive that he couldn't recognize an alien? Or was he pretending to be ignorant? "I am Thyla," she replied, her voice softer now. "I come from another world." The man's eyes widened. "Another world? Are you a alien?" Zyla nodded, her alien nature finally sinking in. She could see the man processing what she had said, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. But instead of fear, he was more curious than anything. He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on her. "You don't look like the aliens I've seen in movies," he said. His tone was light, almost playful, but there was an underlying caution in his stance. Zyla found herself unsure of what to do next. She had expected fear, perhaps even aggression. But instead, this human seemed more curious than anything, as if he were meeting something new and exciting rather than something dangerous. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice more curious now. The man scratched his head, his face lighting up with a half-smile. I could ask you the same thing. This isn't exactly the place for a vacation. Zyla narrowed her eyes, confused but intrigued. Something about this human didn't fit the picture she had imagined. He didn't seem like a predator, or at least, not in the way she thought. He seemed different, and for the first time since landing on Earth, Zyla found herself wondering if she had misunderstood humans after all. Zyla stood still, watching the human closely. He had a strange look on his face, as though trying to figure her out, much like how she was trying to understand him. She could sense his caution, but it wasn't the kind of fear she had expected. Instead, there was something else in his eyes. Curiosity, perhaps even fascination. But she wasn't sure if that was good or bad. Her species had always been cautious when dealing with unfamiliar beings, and this human was definitely unfamiliar. He took another step toward her, his hand resting lightly on the handle of a knife at his side. Zyla's eyes darted down to it, her instincts telling her that this human might be a threat. Her species didn't need weapons. They had evolved far beyond that. But humans, they were still so tied to their primitive tools. She could easily overpower him, if it came to that, but there was something about the situation that didn't sit right with her. What do you want? The man asked, his voice steady but guarded. He had stopped advancing, keeping a safe distance between them. His eyes flickered from her face to the sharp claws on her hands. He wasn't sure what to make of her. To him, she looked dangerous. I mean you no harm, Zyla said, her voice firm, but the words came out sharper than she intended. She didn't like how vulnerable she felt. In her world, she was in control. But here on Earth, surrounded by the unknown, that was no longer true. The man raised an eyebrow but didn't move. You're not from around here, are you? He seemed to be processing her words, thinking about the situation carefully. His hand relaxed on the knife. You said you're from another world. Yes, Zyla replied, taking a deep breath to calm herself. She didn't want to appear weak, especially not in front of this human. I am Zyla, from a far-off planet. My ship malfunctioned. I need to repair it. The human looked her up and down again, clearly still uncertain. Well, I'm not sure how I can help you with that, but you're not gonna eat me, are you? His question was strange, and his voice had an almost joking tone, but Zyla could see he was still on edge. Eat you? Zyla repeated, her mind trying to catch up with the words. She had never encountered a species so fixated on food in such a primitive way. Of course, her species had evolved past that need centuries ago, but this human seemed to have a different view of the world. I don't eat people. That's not. The human blinked, clearly surprised by her answer. I thought aliens always wanted to eat humans in the movies, he said, still half laughing, half wary. That's what they always show. Big, scary creatures that eat you. Zyla frowned, her mind racing. Movies? Humans had movies about aliens. Was that how they viewed creatures like her? Was that their idea of what she was? A monster. She stepped back slightly, realizing how much of her appearance might be contributing to the misunderstanding. Her alien form, her sharp claws, glowing skin, and the faintly predatory way she moved might easily frighten someone who wasn't used to seeing creatures like her. She looked dangerous, no doubt about it. No, Zyla said again, her voice softer now. I don't want to eat you. I'm not a monster. She tried to show him that she meant no harm, though she wasn't sure how. After all, she didn't even know how to explain herself properly in their strange, limited language. The human took another step forward, this time with more confidence. All right then, what are you going to do? Just hang out here in the woods. He scanned the trees, his eyes moving over the wilderness around them. You're not exactly dressed for survival, you know. I'm guessing you don't know how to build a fire or catch food, right? Zyla's eyes narrowed. I don't need food the way you do, she said, still confused. My kind. We've moved beyond that. His eyebrows shot up. You don't eat. What do you? What you just live off? Light or energy? He seemed genuinely curious now, and Tyla could sense that he wasn't mocking her. He was just trying to understand. Yes, she replied, her voice more certain now. I feed off energy, not like you. But that's not the point. I need to repair my ship, and I can't do it alone. The human scratched his chin. Well, I might not be able to help you with whatever alien thing you need to fix, but I know this place pretty well. I can show you where to find food, water, and maybe help you with shelter if you want. Scylla blinked. She had expected the human to be hostile or fearful, but instead he was offering his help. It was an odd reaction, one she wasn't prepared for, but there was something about this human that made her hesitate. Was he truly willing to work with her? To help an alien? Why would you help me? She asked, still suspicious. He shrugged casually. I'm a survivalist. I know what it's like to be stuck in the wilderness. You don't need to be from another world for me to offer help. His tone softened. Besides, I think we both could use a little help right now. Scylla stood silently, weighing his words. She had come to Earth expecting a hostile, savage species, humans who would either try to kill or eat her. But instead, this man was offering cooperation. Something wasn't right, but she couldn't deny that it felt different. Maybe this human wasn't what she had imagined. And maybe, just maybe, humanity wasn't as primitive as she thought. The next day, Hyla and Jonathan walked deeper into the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the sound of birds echoed around them. The human, Jonathan, had shown no fear since their strange first meeting. In fact, he seemed almost at ease with her presence, as though their worlds were not so far apart. Scylla couldn't understand it. Most species would have either run or attacked when faced with a being like her, yet Jonathan remained calm and curious. She found herself both intrigued and irritated by his refusal to be intimidated. Scylla had been walking silently beside him for hours. She had agreed to let him help her gather supplies for her ship repairs, though she still didn't understand why he was so eager to assist. The idea of a human offering help to an alien, especially one who could easily overpower him, seemed almost absurd to her. She kept her guard up, watching him carefully from the corner of her eye. There was something about him that felt off, something she couldn't quite place. Jonathan, for his part, seemed genuinely helpful. He showed her how to gather fresh water from a nearby stream and how to identify edible plants. He seemed comfortable in the forest, moving through it with a calm that Scylla found strange. He had told her that he was a survivalist, but she had no idea what that meant. Still, she couldn't help but notice his resourcefulness. He was quick on his feet, always thinking ahead, and not once did he seem afraid of the dangers the forest might hold. As they ventured further, Tyla began to feel an uncomfortable unease creeping up inside her. They were far from her crashed ship now, and the deeper they went into the woods, the more she realized just how isolated they were. Her technology, the one thing she trusted above all else, was still useless. She had tried to scan for any signal or tech to help her repair her ship, but it was all dead. Everything was dead. She was beginning to feel vulnerable. Do you have a plan, or are we just wandering around? Scylla asked, trying to mask her growing anxiety. She had always been in control, and this sense of being lost, of being dependent on a human for help, unsettled her. Jonathan glanced at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. I have a plan, just not one you'll like. We're looking for shelter first. There's a cave nearby. Once we're safe for the night, we can start figuring out how to get your ship fixed. But for now, the main thing is survival. Scylla was about to respond when she heard a rustling in the trees. Her muscles tensed, and her eyes darted toward the noise. Jonathan noticed her sudden change in posture and looked around, his hand moving subtly to his knife. The rustling grew louder, and a low growl echoed through the forest. Scylla's heart rate quickened, her senses alert. She was used to this feeling. Danger was never far behind, and it was often her first instinct to attack. But she didn't know what was out there. "I think we're not alone," Jonathan muttered. He dropped to a crouch, motioning for Xyla to follow. "Stay low. I don't know what it is, but we don't want to take any chances." Xyla knelt beside him, her sharp eyes scanning the area. She could see shadows moving between the trees. It was hard to make out what exactly was out there, but the growls were unmistakable. Something was hunting them. "Is it a predator?" she asked, her voice tight with tension. Jonathan nodded, his expression serious. "Yeah, but it's not one you'll find in your survival manuals. We need to move now." Before Xyla could ask more, a large, shadowy figure leaped from the trees, its massive body crashing onto the ground in front of them. It was like nothing she had ever seen. 4 legs, a thick, muscled body, and a row of sharp teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Its eyes locked onto Jonathan first, and then it turned to her. Its growl was deep and menacing. "Stay back," Jonathan shouted, drawing his knife. Xyla didn't wait for further instructions. Her alien instincts kicked in. She moved faster than the human could see, her sharp claws extending as she leaped forward, taking the creature by surprise. With one swift motion, she slashed at its side, her claws cutting through its tough hide. The creature howled in pain, stumbling back. Jonathan's eyes widened, a mix of awe and fear. He had no idea Xyla was capable of such speed and power, but he wasn't about to back down. He lunged at the creature, stabbing it with his knife. The creature staggered, clearly wounded, but it wasn't done yet. With another fierce growl, it lunged back at Xyla, swiping its massive claws at her. She barely had time to react. The creature's claws grazed her arm, tearing through her skin. It stung, but she didn't feel the pain as much as the anger boiling inside her. She wasn't going to let this thing take her down. Xyla moved with lightning speed, dodging the creature's next strike. With a powerful swipe, she ripped through its throat, ending the fight in an instant. The creature fell to the ground, its growls turning into a gurgling silence. Jonathan stood frozen, staring at the fallen creature. You killed it," he said, his voice shaky. Xyla wiped the blood off her claws, her chest heaving. "It was either me or it," she said calmly, though her heart was racing. The adrenaline still surged through her body, but she couldn't ignore the strange feeling that had settled inside her. She had fought like a predator, but she had never needed to do so in this way before. Fighting beside a human, not against one. Jonathan looked at her, a mix of respect and disbelief in his eyes. "You're not like any alien I've ever heard of," he said quietly. Xyla didn't answer. She was still too shaken, too aware of how close she had come to losing control. She was beginning to realize that this journey, this strange partnership with a human, was not going to be as simple as she thought. After the creature's body had been dealt with, Xyla and Jonathan didn't speak for a while. The weight of what had just happened hung in the air between them. Xyla wiped her claws clean, her mind still processing the encounter. The fight had been swift, but it had left her unsettled. She wasn't used to working with someone else, especially a human. And yet, she realized, Jonathan hadn't hesitated to fight alongside her. Despite his initial fear and curiosity, he had fought as if his life depended on it. Jonathan moved to the creature's body, crouching beside it and poking it with the tip of his knife. "It's not every day you get saved by an alien," he muttered, still in shock. "I'm guessing you don't get into many fights like that on your planet." Xyla didn't respond immediately. She was too busy scanning the area, making sure nothing else was lurking in the shadows. It wasn't the first time she had faced danger, but it was the first time she'd had a human beside her during such a confrontation. Her species, despite their advanced technology, had always relied on their own strength to survive. Yet here she was, working alongside a primitive species that was still learning how to harness the power of their planet. The irony wasn't lost on her. "I didn't expect to be fighting today," Xyla finally said, her voice low. But we can't afford to let our guard down. Not here. Jonathan stood and wiped his knife clean on the creature's fur. Yeah, I get that. He glanced at her. So, what's the plan now? I'm assuming that creature isn't the only danger out here. Zyla's eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't realized how much she'd come to depend on her own instincts, her own alien senses, to navigate through the wilderness. Jonathan, despite his survival skills, seemed blind to the dangers lurking just beyond the trees. We keep moving, she said, her tone firm. But we need to be smarter about it. The ship is still a long way off, and we can't risk encountering more of those creatures. Jonathan nodded. I'll follow your lead. I know this forest, but I don't know your world. Zyla eyed him, wondering what exactly he meant. It was true. He knew the forest, but this wasn't just about surviving in the wilderness. This was about trusting each other, something she wasn't sure she could do. Humans had their own way of thinking, their own sense of survival, and sometimes that led to unpredictable actions. She had learned from the failures of other species who thought they could control everything. She wasn't sure if humans had learned that lesson yet. As they began to move again, Jonathan fell into step beside her, his presence surprisingly steady. He seemed to be constantly observing the surroundings, though it was clear that his attention was more focused on her than the forest. There was an unspoken tension between them, one that neither of them acknowledged, but both could feel. The hours passed, and soon they came upon a rocky ridge that overlooked the forest below. The view was breathtaking, but Zyla wasn't interested in the scenery. She was more concerned with finding a place to set up for the night. The day's events had drained her, both physically and mentally. She needed rest, and more than that, she needed to find a way to repair her ship. We can make camp here, Jonathan said, pointing to a small outcropping of rocks. It'll give us a good vantage point. If anything tries to sneak up on us, we'll see it coming. Zyla hesitated for a moment before nodding. It wasn't a bad idea. She could feel the wariness settling in, and this spot would give them the cover they needed. As they gathered materials for a fire, Jonathan glanced over at her again, his curiosity never seeming to wane. You know, I still can't get over the fact that you're an alien. Like, you're real, and you're not trying to kill me. Zyla raised an eyebrow, unable to hide her bemusement. What, you thought I was going to eat you or something? Jonathan shrugged sheepishly. Maybe not eat you, but definitely maybe blast me with some kind of energy weapon. She couldn't help but let out a small laugh at the idea. I don't carry weapons like that. At least not the kind you're used to. Jonathan looked at her, considering her words. So you don't have any way to defend yourself beyond that? Zyla clenched her fists, the sharp claws extending involuntarily. I don't need weapons, she said simply. I'm my own defense. Jonathan's eyes widened in admiration. Guess I'd better not get on your bad side. Zyla didn't answer. She wasn't sure how she felt about Jonathan's humor anymore. It was hard to know if he was being genuine, or if he was just trying to make light of their situation. He didn't seem to understand the gravity of their situation. Still, she had to admit that his presence, for all its oddities, made the isolation a little easier to bear. As the fire crackled to life, Zyla felt the tension in her shoulders ease, but her mind was still racing. She had come to Earth expecting to deal with humans like all the others, violent, destructive, and irrational. But Jonathan was different. He wasn't perfect, far from it, but there was something in him that made her second-guess everything she thought she knew about humans. Was it possible that humans weren't the hopelessly flawed species she had assumed them to be? For the first time since her arrival, Zyla found herself unsure of what to expect next. She had her mission, yes, but this encounter with Jonathan, this strange, uneasy alliance, was beginning to change things in ways she couldn't yet understand. And though she didn't want to admit it, she knew that she might need Jonathan more than she had ever expected. The fire crackled, its warm glow flickering over the rocky outcrop where Zyla and Jonathan had set up camp. The night was cool, and the sounds of the forest seemed louder now that the tension of their earlier encounter had passed. The creature they'd fought still lay a few feet away, a reminder of the danger that lurked in the shadows of the alien world. Jonathan stared into the flames, his thoughts far away. Zyla could tell by the way he stared at the fire that he was struggling with something beyond the normal survival worries. She had noticed it earlier, the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The curiosity, the questions he had that he couldn't quite voice. Humans were strange in that way. They'd wanted to know everything, yet they were often too cautious to ask. "Do you always stare at your fire like that?" Kyla's voice broke the silence, and Jonathan jerked his head up, as if startled from a deep thought. "Huh. Oh, I guess I do when I'm thinking," he said, a sheepish smile tugging at his lips. "It helps me focus. So, what's it like, being from another planet? I mean, you've probably seen things I can't even imagine." Zyla studied him for a moment. There it was, the question she had been expecting. Humans, always wanting to know more. The truth was, she wasn't sure how to explain it to him. Her world, her people, her experiences, none of it would make sense to someone like Jonathan. How could she explain the vastness of the universe, the complexity of her species, without sounding like she was boasting? And more importantly, how could she explain her mission here without revealing too much? "I've seen many things," Zyla finally said, her voice quiet, careful. "Things you couldn't understand. My people, we're not like you. We've evolved beyond the need for survival the way you do." Jonathan didn't speak at first, just watched her, his expression open and curious. "What do you mean? You're saying you don't need food or water or shelter?" Zyla shook her head. "We still need those things, but we don't fight to survive. We don't struggle like you do. We've learned to live in harmony with the energy of our world." Jonathan's eyes widened, his curiosity piqued. "Energy? You mean like electricity?" "No," Zyla replied, shaking her head again. "Not like electricity. More primal. It's the energy that flows through everything, that connects everything. We've learned to harness it, to live with it, not fight against it." She paused, watching the flames dance in the fire. "But that's not what I'm here for." Jonathan blinked, as if he was trying to process what she had said. "So, you're saying you can, like, control energy? Like superpowers?" Zyla let out a soft laugh. "I wouldn't call it superpowers, but yes, in a way." For a moment, Jonathan didn't know how to respond. He had heard stories, of course, of people with extraordinary abilities, but the idea of an alien being with such powers was something else entirely. "Wow, that's incredible," he finally said. "So, what happened? Why are you here on Earth, alone?" Zyla's expression darkened, and Jonathan immediately regretted asking the question. He had meant it out of curiosity, but he could see that it had struck a nerve. The way she had been talking, there was more to her story than just a simple crash landing. "I'm not here by choice," Zyla said quietly, her voice colder now. "My ship malfunctioned. A mistake. On my part. I was supposed to be traveling to a different system, but something went wrong. I crash-landed here, and now I have to fix it." Jonathan didn't speak right away, sensing that there was more to the story. Zyla had never seemed particularly open about her past, but it wasn't hard to see the pain in her eyes now. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to bring up bad memories." Kyla gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "It's fine," she said, but there was a sadness in her voice that she couldn't fully hide. "This isn't a place for me. I don't belong here." Jonathan wanted to ask more, to dig deeper into the mystery of Zyla's story, but he hesitated. There was something about her that made him want to protect her, something that made him feel like they were both lost in this strange world. Maybe it was because he didn't understand her, but maybe that was why he felt drawn to help her. She wasn't like anyone he had ever met, not even close. "Hey, we're all just trying to figure things out, right?" Jonathan said after a pause, trying to lighten the mood. I mean, I'm stuck here with you, aren't I? I don't really know what I'm doing either. Thyla turned her gaze to him, her eyes softening slightly. She had never thought of it that way. She had been so focused on getting out of this world, getting back to her people, that she hadn't considered how Jonathan might be feeling. He was stuck here with her, after all. He had no idea what her world was like, no idea what she was capable of, and yet he was still here, offering help. It was a strange thought, and for the first time, Thyla wasn't sure what to do with it. You're not like the others, she said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Most humans, they wouldn't help me. They would have tried to hurt me, or run away. Jonathan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. Maybe I'm not like the others, he said, his voice low. But I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere. You've got me until you get that ship fixed. Thyla was silent for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. She wasn't used to feeling this, uncertain. She had always been the one in control, always the one who decided what happened next. But now, here she was, relying on a human, and in some strange way, she was starting to trust him. Thank you, she said quietly, though it was a word she rarely used. Jonathan smiled. No problem. But deep down, both of them knew that this strange, uneasy alliance was about to get even more complicated. Neither of them fully understood the path ahead, but one thing was certain: their lives were now forever connected. And whatever came next, they would have to face it together. The following morning came too quickly, the sun breaking through the dense canopy above and casting a weak light on the forest floor. Thyla had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of her mission, her ship, and the human beside her. Jonathan, however, seemed to have slept soundly, as though he had no care in the world. It was hard for her to understand. How could he be so calm in the face of such uncertainty? She had crashed on his planet, and he was helping her without hesitation. It felt wrong, in a way. She had always been taught that humans were unpredictable, dangerous. Yet Jonathan defied all of that. Thyla stood up from the rocky ledge where they had made their camp. The day ahead would bring more challenges, more creatures to fight, more survival to master. She needed to focus on fixing her ship, but there was something nagging at her. The longer she stayed on Earth, the more her mission felt off. Something wasn't right. And it wasn't just the crash. Jonathan was still poking at the fire when she approached. He looked up and gave her a tired but warm smile. Morning. You slept all right. Thyla didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked into the distance, scanning the trees for any signs of movement. The forest was eerily quiet, but she knew better than to trust silence. Danger could be waiting just around the corner. We need to get moving, Thyla said, her voice curt. She didn't have time for small talk, not when there were bigger issues at hand. Jonathan's face dropped slightly. He could see the tension in her shoulders and the way she kept scanning the trees. She had a way of acting like she didn't care about anyone, but Jonathan was starting to see through that exterior. She was trying to protect herself, protect him, and maybe even protect her mission. But Jonathan was beginning to wonder, what was that mission, really? What was Thyla hiding? All right, he said, standing up. I'll pack up and grab the supplies. We'll head to the ship. Thyla nodded, but something in her voice stopped Jonathan from walking away. There's something I need to tell you, Jonathan, she said, her voice quieter than usual. He turned back to her, brow furrowed in concern. What's going on? Thyla took a deep breath. The decision she had been avoiding, the truth she had been keeping to herself, now seemed impossible to hide any longer. Jonathan had been too kind, too helpful for her to keep this secret from him. She couldn't afford to trust him fully. Not yet. But she knew she needed to give him something. I'm not just stranded here because of a malfunction, she began. There's more to it. The crash, the repairs, it's all part of a bigger plan. A plan I can't share with you completely. Jonathan's eyes narrowed in suspicion. He had a feeling this was coming. What do you mean? What's really going on? Zyla took a step forward, her gaze meeting his. My mission wasn't just to explore or gather resources. I was sent here to. She was cut off by a sharp, distant sound. A low, vibrating hum. Zyla immediately tensed, her alien senses picking up the faint disturbance in the air. Jonathan didn't seem to notice it, his eyes still locked on her, waiting for an answer. What was that? Jonathan asked, his voice uncertain. Thyla's eyes flicked around the forest. The hum was growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the sky, something far above them. We need to move now, she said, her tone urgent. Jonathan stood frozen for a moment, trying to process what she was saying. But Thyla was already moving. She grabbed her gear, her sharp eyes scanning the tree line as she darted forward, her footsteps quick and silent. Jonathan followed her, the question still hanging in the air, but he didn't have time to ask. The sound was getting closer, and it wasn't just a noise anymore. It was a presence, something far more dangerous. They moved swiftly through the forest, Thyla leading the way, her alien senses guiding her every step. Jonathan did his best to keep up, but the forest was dense and unforgiving. The hum was growing louder, now accompanied by a low mechanical whirring sound. Whatever it was getting closer. Thyla, what's going on? Jonathan called out, his voice trained with fear. She didn't answer, her focus entirely on the approaching threat. They reached a small clearing, and Zyla stopped, scanning the sky above them. Jonathan's eyes followed her gaze, but he couldn't see anything at first. Then something shifted in the clouds, a small, fast-moving shape. It was hard to make out, but it was clearly not an animal. It was too smooth, too metallic. That's not a ship, Jonathan whispered, his heart pounding. What is it? Thyla's face was grim. It's a tracking device. It's from my people. Jonathan stared at her, confusion taking over. Your people? She nodded. I wasn't sent here alone, Jonathan. The crash wasn't an accident. My people know I'm here. They've been following me. Jonathan's eyes widened in realization. You're not stranded. You're being hunted. Zyla didn't answer, but the expression on her face said it all. This wasn't a simple repair mission. This wasn't just a case of bad luck. Zyla was being hunted, and she had brought Jonathan into it. We need to find shelter, Zyla said, her voice tight. Now. They won't stop until they find me. Jonathan could feel the weight of her words. The forest, once just a dangerous place, now felt like a trap, and Jonathan was caught in the middle of it. But as much as he wanted to ask more questions, as much as he wanted to understand everything, there was no time. He had to trust her. Whatever was coming next, they were in this together. The air was thick with tension as Thyla and Jonathan moved deeper into the forest, the distant hum of the tracking device still echoing above them. Every step felt heavier, every rustle in the trees more threatening. They had to keep moving, but there was nowhere to hide, not from what was coming for them. Zyla's eyes scanned the tree line, her alien senses picking up every shift in the air, every movement of the ground beneath her. She was used to being pursued, but this was different. Her people had never sent such a force after her before. They had always been a step ahead. Now she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep running. And Jonathan, he was with her. The thought gnawed at her. She couldn't let him get hurt, not because of her. We have to keep going, Zyla said, her voice firm. She wasn't sure if she was telling Jonathan or herself. There's a cave up ahead. It's our best chance. Jonathan nodded, his face grim. Lead the way. They pushed forward, moving faster now, not stopping to rest or look around. The sounds of the forest felt like they were closing in on them, the noise of something large moving through the trees, chasing them. Every so often, Zyla would stop and check the sky, making sure they weren't being tracked. But the metallic hum of the device kept getting louder. Finally, they reached the cave. It was small, but it offered shelter, and that was all they could ask for at this point. Zyla motioned for Jonathan to stay low as they slipped inside. The cave's narrow opening was well hidden by the dense trees, but that wouldn't stop the hunters. It would only delay them. Inside, Zyla took a deep breath and lowered her pack to the ground. Her mind was racing, but there was no time to plan. She had to act now, or they would both be dead. Jonathan followed her, his face pale with fear but determined. "What happens now?" Jonathan asked quietly, his voice tight. Zyla turned to face him. "Now, we wait." Jonathan didn't look convinced. "Wait for what? You said they wouldn't stop coming." "I know," she replied, her eyes hardening, "but I have a way to stop them." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? What are you going to do?" Zyla hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. She had hoped it wouldn't come to this, but she was out of time. "I have a device. It's a fail-safe. If I activate it, it'll send a signal to my people, warning them of the danger. It'll stop the tracking device and hopefully make them retreat. But it's risky." Jonathan's eyebrows furrowed. "Risky? What kind of risk?" Zyla looked at him, her expression serious. "It could put us both in the direct path of their ships. If they detect the signal, they'll know where we are. They might come to finish the job. Or they might just send more of their machines to get us." Jonathan swallowed hard. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined. This wasn't just a simple rescue mission. This was life or death. He was in the middle of a battle between two worlds, and the only way out was through. "What do we do?" Jonathan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Zyla took a deep breath. "We have no choice. We need to activate the device, and then we run. As fast and as far as we can. We'll need to split up if we want to confuse them." Jonathan didn't hesitate. "I'm with you. Let's do it." Zyla nodded, her sharp eyes scanning the entrance to the cave once more. She pulled the small device from her pack, a sleek, metallic object that hummed with energy. Her fingers trembled slightly as she activated it. For a moment, there was nothing, just the soft crackle of static. Then, the cave was filled with a low, resonating hum. It was the signal she had feared would come. The tracking device above them went silent, but then the ground shook. The faint sound of engines roaring in the distance grew louder. The hunters were coming. "We don't have much time," Zyla said, her voice urgent. She stood and grabbed Jonathan's arm, pulling him toward the back of the cave. "Follow me. Don't make a sound." Jonathan nodded, his pulse quickening. He had no idea how this would end, but there was no turning back now. Zyla had made her choice, and he was right there with her. They scrambled through the cave's narrow passageways, their bodies pressed close to the cool stone walls. The sound of engines grew deafening, and Zyla's heart pounded in her chest. She had only one chance to make this work. If they were caught, they wouldn't survive. Jonathan was human. He wasn't trained for this kind of battle, but Zyla would protect him. She would die before she let her mission put him in harm's way. They emerged into a small clearing on the far side of the cave, where Zyla had hidden a small stash of supplies. She quickly reached into her pack and pulled out a small device, pressing it to the ground. The ground shook again, but this time it was different. The sky above them darkened as a massive ship descended from the clouds, blocking out the sun. Zyla's eyes flashed with determination. "We're not done yet," she whispered, as the ship's engines roared louder. "Now we fight." And with that, Zyla and Jonathan prepared for the final showdown. No more running, no more hiding. This was their moment.